Some of the audience who are not Oi. Okay, today we will cover the second half of the Sermon on the Mount. Last time we got up to the middle of chapter 6, and those earlier, the first half is mostly about religious duties, religious functions, things that are directly connected with understanding of the Torah, understanding of religious behavior. This second half is more generic, dealing with life in general. And so I'm titling the second half as a thing called life. It's what Jesus is looking at. The first thing that he draws attention to is what I'm calling, for want of a better phrase, and that is the idea of where do we put our treasure, safety deposit box concept. Jesus says that you should store up treasure in heaven. And yet, all of us spend most of our life trying to store up treasure on earth, whether you think of treasure in terms of money, a bank balance, job security, pension, or whichever form you might take, even health insurance, and some of those kinds of things. And so Jesus makes a contrast between heavenly treasure and earthly treasure. And he provides some reasons why earthly treasure is not really durable. One is he says that earthly treasure can be destroyed by moth. This is what some Bible scholars have called the corruption of nature. We live in Southeast Asia where there's a lot of humidity. And if your clothes are not used or aired out and you leave them in the closet for a long time, they can get moldy. That happens simply because nature takes its toll. This happens to clothes, to shoes, to books. I can remember leaving a box of books in my hometown after graduation for a long time. When I went back, most of them were basically falling apart because of the mold and the humidity and the wetness of the town. Then he says that earthly treasure is also affected by rust. Now, the place where you can see rust most easily is wherever there's metal. And so if you live in island countries where cars are exposed to the seawater with all of its salt, body rust develops very quickly. But the thing about rust is that it requires time. And so you may not see it for a few years, but then once it catches on, it begins to break down the metal. This is why we paint anything that is made of metal. We paint them on a regular basis because otherwise they will start to rust somewhere. So time brings its own corruption, Jesus says. And then, of course, thieves. This is the human corruption. There are always people trying to take advantage of us, financially or otherwise. There's a very curious episode on the internet right now. The Olympics are going on in Paris, and there's a Filipino gymnast who won 2 gold medals. He has won prizes before, but these are his first Olympic medals. And his mother is the one who's been managing his money. And there was a little spat online between him and his mom because he's saying that he doesn't know where his money has gone. He's never seen it. And he wants to know what his mom has done with the money. I have a feeling that the mother may be embezzling money from her son. It sounds like that because she can't explain what happened to the money. And so they're having an online fight, mother and son. And he's even saying, "Oh, I've forgiven you, even though I don't know what you did with my money. It's disappeared." He's talking about the previous money that he got for other events. Now, when he gets back to the Philippines, he's going to get this huge cash bonus from the government. I mean, a really, really big sum of money. And so, even family can be a problem when you dangle that much money in front of them. So Jesus says, if you store anything on earth, nature, time, and humans are going to ruin it in some way or another. Think of bad investments. I just met a couple, they are foreigners, but they bought a house, a townhouse, but they can't buy in their own name because they're foreigners. So they entered into a contract with some local person through an agency, and using that person's name to purchase the property. And so I asked the question, what if that person goes about claiming it for themselves? You don't know the person, you've never really met the person, and you're putting a lot of trust in a total stranger. And they seem to think that the agency has put enough building blocks to make sure that that doesn't happen. But it's very risky to trust your treasures to humans. What Jesus is saying here is what matters in life is treasure. The only question is, where do you put your treasure? Because he said, wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. And heart in the Bible always means the mind. And so if our treasure is on earth, our mind will be very earth-bound. If our treasure is in heaven, it will be very heaven-bound. So he's not saying that we shouldn't have treasure. He's just saying where we should have treasure. It's all about treasure. One that is eternal and lasting, one that is fleeting and temporary. The second issue that Jesus touches is what we call in our world today a worldview. He uses the concept of eyes. He says that what you see with your eyes is what really matters about how life plays out. And he seems to suggest this idea that if you're healthy, if your eyes are healthy, you will see the healthy things. It's like the perspective of life, developing of a worldview that is truly positive rather than negative. And I understand how important this is, because if I remove my glasses, I can't really see much. And so everything around me changes. Things are not very clear. People can become blurry. I can't see faces easily. And of course, I can never drive. And so it changes my worldview. And so Jesus pushes the idea that we need to develop healthy eyes, by which he means proper worldview. But here's one that has a very modern ring. He says no one can serve two masters. Or perhaps we should put it multiple masters. One of the favorite terms by modern people to explain their busyness in life is multitasking. And yes, we run into an irony. Brain science research tells us that the human brain cannot multitask any more than a computer can multitask. What the brain does, and the computer works exactly the same way, is that it can move so fast from one task to the other that you actually think you are multitasking. In other words, you can't really be on the phone talking to somebody while watching a movie. But your brain, the electrochemical impulses in your brain through the synapses of the brain travel at such high speeds that you're not aware of the movement back and forth between one activity and the other. So brain science backs up what Jesus is saying. You cannot serve two masters. And of course, there's a deeper lesson here that, there can only be one God in life. I had an interesting experience with a group of nurses recently where we dealt with the first commandment, you shall have no other God. And then I asked them to take out their mobile phone and figure out how much of their life is dictated by this little gadget and how dependent we are on it. So I raised the question, don't you think that's really like a God? And so they had a a discussion about it. Um, Multitasking is an illusion. It makes us feel better about ourselves, that somehow we can do more. And so many of us apply it even at the spiritual level, that I can serve God and keep His Sabbath while also, paying full attention to my job, my career, my profession. And yet, truth be told, is 6 days of the week, it's all about our work. God really matters on the one day that we call Sabbath, or whatever day of worship we may have. Jesus takes this a step further. He says, if you have two masters, you will never love both of them. You will end up loving one and hating the other. And when you're driving, you become very acutely aware of this reality, because you know that you cannot keep your eyes on the road and turn around your head looking and having a conversation with your passenger, whoever that is, whether it's family or just friends. And this is why most countries do not allow you to use your mobile phone while you're driving. Thailand has introduced that rule, but they're having a hard time to really implement it, because people have gotten used. You can see people in Thailand riding a motorcycle with one hand and talking with the phone on the other hand. And you know what can happen when accidents happen because of that multitasking, as we call it? It's pretty dangerous. It's pretty life-threatening. Most people in today's world take a great deal of pride in multitasking, but it's also a main reason why they never really finish their job, why there's always work left over. Because the brain, according to scientific research, in the process of moving back and forth from one task to the other, creates what we understand in computer, what are called ghost folders. And if you do not clean up your computer on a regular basis, these ghost folders, you have to do fragmentation or some process of removing them, um, optimizing them. Your mobile phone will give you a signal saying that they need to optimize the apps. Some are not using, so we put it to sleep, because it slows down the computer. And the exact same thing happens in the brain. Moving back and forth between activities actually slows down our brain patterns. That's why when we worship God, we need to concentrate on worship and not trying to concentrate on your mobile phone or some other activity, or worrying about the meeting that you have on Sunday with your boss or whatever, Eastern religions have understood this for a long time. And that is why meditation is such an important part of Eastern religions: Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism. That ability or that willingness to focus your mind, focus your brain on one thing and one thing only. And Jesus seems to be promoting a certain version of it. You cannot love God, you cannot love money at the same time. One will overtake the other, one will push the other out of the picture. All right, and that brings us to another view of this issue about worldview, and that is perspective. Jesus says, why do you worry about food, about clothes, when all you have to do is recognize that God is supplying those things? It is not because we have a good job that we have good food. There are lots of people who have good jobs, but they don't eat right. And there are lots of very simple people with minimal income, but they have healthy meals because they can't afford the carb-rich or sugar-rich meals or whatever. Jesus says that worry is the antithesis of faith. It took me such a long time in life to realize the veracity of this statement of Christ. The antithesis of faith is not doubt. Doubt is actually encouraged in the Bible, because doubt draws us closer to God. It helps us to ask questions, to want answers. But worry definitely is the antithesis. When the disciples were worried about the boat capsizing in the storm, then they wake Jesus up and says, "Don't you care? We are about to die." His first words to them is, "Why is your faith so small?" In other words, what are you worried about? It's all, excuse me, it's almost like saying, "I'm here, I'm in the boat. What are you worried about?" Years ago, I heard an African preacher. I don't remember his sermon, but I remember one line from his sermon because it was also the title of his sermon. He says that the safest place to be in a storm of life is in the boat with Christ. Because no matter how scared you get, no matter how fearful, no matter how anxious you get, that boat cannot capsize because Christ is on it. The storm can blow all around, but the boat will be fine. And so the disciples had to learn that lesson. I think Jesus deliberately took them on the sea. We have a lot of debate in the archaeological world if a storm like that could have actually happened on the Sea of Galilee, where most people think the story takes place. There's a new theory now among archaeologists because of some other evidences that it did not happen on the Sea of Galilee. It's too small for that kind of storm. A sea that you can look from one side to the other, also rather shallow. And so Jesus and the disciples were most probably on the Mediterranean Sea. And that ocean, it's a major sea with major storms on the Mediterranean. We know it happened to Jonah, same sea, to Paul, same sea. Paul was shipwrecked in Cyprus. And so the disciples, I have a feeling Jesus took them out on that open sea so that they will learn that their boat, even though it's rocking up and down with the waves, that's the safe place. Not to try and jump out of the boat into the water or whatever. And then he tells them to do this. Why do you worry about food or clothes? Look at what God has made. Look at the flowers. Look at the birds. He says birds don't build barns, but God supplies their needs. Flowers are here today, but they're gone tomorrow, but they are more beautiful than Solomon in all of his glory. Very powerful way of polarizing thought that Jesus uses in this section. And perhaps the reason he's suggesting this is that most of us don't spend time looking at the creation of God. That if God can sustain those fragile flowers in the field, if God can sustain those birds. I've had this pair of yellowneck bulbul, as they're called, have been nesting on my little bush in the front yard. They did again once this year, and they've been there like 4 or 5 times now. I watch them build their little nest. They whatever they can find, everything from grass to toilet paper they use to build the nest, and then put their babies or their eggs there and incubate. And then I've never seen the fledglings fly off, but in one of those occasions, the eggs were still there one day, and I went back a couple of days later, and the nest was empty. The eggshells were gone. The birds were gone. If the babies lived through, they were gone. If they died, they were not there. It's amazing what nature can teach us. And these things happen on cycles. I remember on one cycle, the babies were hatched. One egg did not hatch, one egg hatched, but the baby died, and the birds left. I actually had to bury the baby bird. And then a few months later, they came back, built another nest, and whether it's the same pair of birds or not, I'm not sure. But they went through the cycle again. Now, Jesus is not saying that we should not pay attention to how we live, that we should not plan, that we should not make contingencies. But he's saying that we can do that without this little thing we call anxiety. And medical science tells us that a lot of illnesses are related to anxiety. We even have terms like psychosomatic. We make ourselves anxious because we don't like the way we look. We make ourselves anxious because we think we don't have enough. We make ourselves anxious because we didn't get the promotion and somebody else did. And I never saw those birds going crazy about the lost babies. Yes, they stayed around the nest for 1 or 2 days and then flew off. And so Jesus says that our worldview must consider not only a perspective of life, but a priority of life. And we all know this verse, one of the best known verses in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, verse 33. Seek first the kingdom of God, and then everything will be added to you. Now, I think we need to be careful about being overly literal, because it doesn't mean that we don't make an effort. Solomon in Kohelet says that we must be diligent. He says, sow your seeds in the morning and sow again in the evening. Work with your right hand, your left hand. You don't know which will really succeed. So be diligent and go about your life. But I think Solomon would agree with Jesus that diligence alone can become workaholism. Whereas seeking the kingdom of God first means that you've got a priority. And no matter what, the priority must be God first, and then the people that are close to you, family, and so on, and then maybe work and other things. I watched a Christian movie this afternoon on YouTube about this young boy. Well, he's 18 years old when you meet him in the movie, who never knew his father, and then his mother gets cancer, and that's when he discovered his father, who was a very, very super rich businessman, architect, runs this giant architect firm, is very rich. And of course, the mother was quite poor. She had to do 2 jobs to keep her boy in school, and a lot of things happened. And then the father came to realize that he had the wrong priority. He realized it from one of his workers. This man had a family, and he was his assistant. He had to do all the architect's blueprints and so on, but he was pushing him to get it done, to stay in the office and get it done. And finally, the man says, no, I have to go home. I have a family. And so the boss says, you must know your priorities. And so his assistant says, yes, I know my priorities. My family is first. The job comes later. I will fire you. You will lose your job. And the man says, I still have to follow my priorities in life. And then, of course, the boss, after he meets his son and he learns about his former, they didn't actually marry, they have a son, but they were in love. His former girlfriends or fiancés, cancer and death, then he begins to realize that his priority should be his son, not his business. But Jesus says that our priority must rise even higher than just family. It must be God first. Elsewhere, when a man came to Jesus asking him if he could go home first and bury his parents who just died, and then he'll follow him, Jesus says, if you do that, then you're having the wrong priority. It's a very difficult saying of Jesus. And in these Gospels, we encounter some really hard sayings of Jesus. But they do illustrate this. We need proper perspective. We need proper priority. Then we will have a good working worldview. Who just joined us? Anyway. Oh, it's Max. Well, well, well. I guess. Hello, Max. You're back from your rapture
Hello.
trip.
Yes.
The next item that Jesus touched on is one that we as humans almost can never get out of, and that is judgmentalism. We have a knack of measuring people consciously, subconsciously, intentionally, to hurt, or with no desire to hurt. We are always judging one another. We judge ourselves, we judge one another. I like the phrase that Samuel used this evening as we were discussing some preaching style. What was the phrase? Body shaming. It's a judgmentalism. Uh, Racism is judgmentalism. Anti-Semitism is judgmentalism. Islamophobia. We invented words for this concept. We sit around, and church people are pretty good at doing this. We judge each other in church by appropriate behavior, appropriate uh, Bible version, appropriate song, appropriate music, uh, even appropriate dress. I can remember one of my really saddest experiences as a pastor was this young new convert, just a few months into the church, was asked to give a testimony in Sabbath school. She came from a purely secular background. This is Singapore. So she came dressed up like she would in her world, going for a party. Nothing outlandish, but not really churchy kind of dress. And as she got ready to go up to the stage, one of the elderly ladies in the church who had been an Adventist all her life walked up to her and said, "What kind of an Adventist are you? Don't you even know how to dress up properly? How can you go up on stage that way?" Now, in Chinese culture, losing face is probably the worst thing. Making a person lose face is one of the worst things that can happen in life. And that girl, she walked away from church and never ever came back because this happened in public. There were other people who heard it, and she felt so judged that she lost face and she never could bring herself back to church. What does Jesus say about this? He says the standard you use in judging others is the standard by which God will judge you. Now, I paraphrase this a little bit. I'd like to think of it this way: if we judge each other by a ruler, a scale, as we could sometimes call it, that is only 1 meter tall, God will judge us by one that is maybe 10 meters long. And this is a very dangerous thing to do. Jesus says the way you judge others is exactly the way God will judge you. And this makes it difficult because he's putting the onus of responsibility upon us as to how we relate to people around us. Then he gives an example. He says, if you see a speck of dust in your brother's eye or in someone else's eye, and yet you have a log. I don't think Jesus literally mean a log as in a big piece of wood, but something much bigger that is stuck in your own eye. But you can't see that. So I'm calling this the speck of dust and log principle. Jesus says you must first remove that log from your eye, the cataract from your eye, before trying to help somebody else remove a smaller cataract from their eyes. And yet, we have a proverb in English or an idiom in English that says this, the very old one, the pot calling the kettle black, but we do that all the time. Now, here's the thing about dust in the eyes. There may be different things that can irritate the eye. Literally a speck of dust or one of your eyelashes that breaks off and gets into the eye, or something that is burning around you, like smoke, or fried chili gets into your eyes. You can't actually get a log into your eye because that would be blind. But the hyperbole that Jesus employs is very intriguing. It's like saying you've got a bigger problem, and yet you're wasting your time judging someone else who has a smaller problem than you. You have a bigger sin, but you're judging someone else's smaller sin. Jesus is not saying that you can't help another person who's got a problem, but he's saying first solve your own problem. Take out the log from your eye. Then he says you can see clearly to remove the speck of dust. This is one of my favorite one, what I call the pearls principle. People often ignore this because it seems to contradict something else that Jesus said about, if they hit you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. The pearls principle says this: don't give your pearls to dogs and pigs, because dogs can still turn around and bite you, and pigs will simply trample the pearls into the mud. See, dogs and pigs have no sense of the value of pearls. Humans do. And I think what Jesus is suggesting, that there are things we must guard, because there are people out there who will not value the same things that we do. And this is why Paul was quite careful about how he identified himself as a Christian, how he spoke to people. And so he would tell them that if I'm in Rome, then I will be like the Romans. If I'm among the Jews, I'll be like the Jews. He doesn't want to cause some discord simply because, oh, this is what I believe. If you don't believe like me, you might go to hell. You know, there are lots of Adventists who are vegan, and somehow they have it in their head that if they are vegan, they are somehow a bit more righteous. Now, that may be a good thing, but not everybody is ready to be a vegan. Now, I try very hard never to explain to people why I'm a vegetarian unless they really ask. I would just simply say, I'm a vegetarian. That's my life choice. Because I know some people cannot really get it, they cannot really understand it. The first time I encountered this was in Hong Kong, when this group of young teachers like myself, we were eating at the Hong Kong banquet, some sports day school. They finally asked me, they said, why are you a vegetarian? And one of them says, is it because of health or is it because of religion? I didn't have an answer then, and at that time. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what would be the best answer. You know, to very, very secular people, but health conscious secular people, they can understand when I talk about the health aspect of being a vegetarian. In fact, they won't contradict me, they will agree. But to people who are more religious, I can use the religious concept of being a vegetarian, how it is part of my faith construct, and they can accept that. But if you have a person who is neither religious nor health conscious, none of those things work. And so instead of just pushing one's vegetarianism or veganism or whatever ism you have, you need to weigh the people that you have to deal with. Can they value it? Would they be willing to value it? And this includes sharing the gospel. You know, not everybody wants to listen to us talk about Sabbath or tithing or judgment or going to heaven. It doesn't matter to them. But there are ways we can still communicate with such people that make sense about the importance of life, the importance of time, and so on. I can still remember trying to explain the concept of Sabbath to St. Paul's Church. This was at a Bible study, and they asked the question, why do you keep Sabbath? You know, and what is the point? So instead of wasting my time with trying to prove that Saturday is the Sabbath, which most Adventists would do, and why they are wrong in keeping Sunday, I explained to them the importance of giving time to God and how this is part of biblical teaching. There was a couple, the peach farmers, and I learned from them that when the peaches ripen at a certain time, that's the day you must pick them. And sometimes that would happen on Sunday. So they would not show up in church because their peaches have to be picked on that day. But after that Bible study dealing with the importance of giving time to God, they decided, without any persuasion or cajoling on my part or even attempt to change their mind, that maybe they should keep the whole Sunday for God. I can still remember the first season that the peaches ripened on a Sunday, and they knew this was the day they must pick the peaches. They were very uncomfortable in church. You can see their anxiety. But they told me afterwards that they did not go to the farm. They stayed until sundown and then went on Monday to pick the peaches. And then they discovered a tremendous thing, that the peaches had not fallen. Nothing had happened to them. It's like they stayed an extra day on the tree. See, when peaches reach the right ripeness, if you don't pick them at that point, they will simply fall. The very next day, they'll fall off to the ground. And so this couple discovered with their own experiment what it means to give what's value time to God. Not every farmer in that church and many farmers in that church necessarily accepted that principle, but it worked for them. So Jesus says, do not give your pearls to dogs and pigs. Not only might they not value you or your pearls, but they might attack you for those very same pearls as well. You know, sometimes there are things that we cannot share with other people, that we can only talk to God about, because people may not understand us and they may not be willing to feel sympathy. Okay. And so this is a very interesting principle that Jesus gives. It helps us to be smart about how we live life, not just to be passive about it. And then this one, the bread, stone, of fish, snake principle. Jesus says, if your children ask you for a bread, would you give them a stone? You know, a rhetorical question. If they ask you for a fish, would you give a snake? And then he turns around and says this, if you who are evil know how to give the good things to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father, who is not evil, who is all good, do for you? It all boils back to that worry principle. Because Jesus is suggesting when we worry and then we start judging people around us and then we lose sight of the proper worldview, it's happening because we don't realize that God is good and that God knows what is good for us and that God will do what is best for us. I have a kind of newer understanding of the name Yahweh. When Moses asked God what your name is, he says, my name is Yahweh. Translated from Hebrew, it means I am who I am. Or a better translation would be, I will be whatever I will be. And I've struggled for a long time to try and make sense of that in today's world, in the history of Christianity, in the history of the Bible. What did God really mean by that name? I am who I am. Tell the Israelites, I am. And whenever you're reading the Old Testament and you see that phrase, God saying, I am, he's actually repeating his name. And I've come to understand this. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, means that God will do and be whatever he needs to do or needs to be according to our needs. So when I have a health need, God becomes the healer. And so we have the name Yahweh Rapha, God the healer. When I'm in some kind of bondage, he becomes the warrior to defeat and break the chains. So Yahweh Sebaoth, the God who is the warrior. When I'm lonely and feeling all alone and burdened by uh, negative thoughts or maybe even a bit depressed, he says, I am Yahweh Shammah. I am the God who is there. When I feel that the whole world is against us, he says, I am Emmanuel. God is with you. That's what Yahweh means. The God who is there, and he will do whatever he needs to do for his people. He will be whatever he needs to do for his people. He says, you who are evil know how to do that with your children. How much more your heavenly Father? This is a very reassuring principle of life that Jesus shared. And then, of course, we have this big one. Christians love it. We cite it. It's one of the few verses from Matthew that we know quite well. The golden rule. And you know what the golden rule says, right? Do unto others what you would like them to do. And then he says, this is the essence or the conclusion of the Torah and the prophets. In other words, this is scripture. This is true spirituality. I like a business definition of the golden rule. It says this: the golden rule is he who has the goal makes the rule. And I think it works with power too. He who has the goal of power makes the goal of policies. But Jesus is talking about reciprocal action. And humans have the ability, it's almost innate within us, to reciprocate. When people are kind, we would like to show kindness. When people are unkind, we react negatively to it. And so Jesus says, not do unto others what they do, but do unto others what you would expect they would do for you. You know, I was walking one afternoon. It was in the middle of the afternoon, it was still quite hot. I needed something. And so there's a 7-Eleven just outside my entry gate to this Muban, but it's about a kilometer walk. And so I decided to walk. Never mind, the sun is a bit hot, but it's not burning hot. And so I walked. About halfway through the walk, a car pulled up next to me and was a lady driving. She stopped beside me and she rolled down her window and said something in Thai. At first, I thought maybe she's asking for some direction, but I didn't fully understand her. So I said, I'm sorry, do you speak English? And she switched to quite fluent English. And she said, do you need a ride? I can drop you at the main road. So I said, no, I don't need a ride. I'm just taking a walk to the 7-Eleven. And then she rolled back her window and she drove off. That's the first time I've been in Thailand over 20 years that somebody has actually stopped to offer a ride. It's not something that's normal in Thailand, but it can happen. People have that ability to reciprocate. When I was preparing to come to Thailand, I read all these tourism by the TAT brochures, and Thailand has this motto that is being sold by the tourism authority: Thailand, the land of smiles. And the first people you meet are the immigration officers. And in all the years I've traveled through the airports in Thailand, I've only met one immigration lady who actually smiled and had a mini conversation with me. They are the most glum people you can ever meet. And so it changed my view of land of smiles. It would be nice if they smile back, but they will even tell you when they ask you to look at the camera not to smile. But think about what life would be like if we are all like that. Jesus says you must have this ability to adjust to the other people around you and not to expect too much from them. And here's the thing, if we don't expect them to be nice, then don't bother when they're not nice. If you expect them to be nice and they're not nice, don't bother about it either. Because Jesus is talking about expecting reciprocal action, not just performing. So I'm nice because you're nice. No. So I'm nice because I hope you will be nice. Do to others what you would like them to do. This is the essence of Torah and prophets. Jesus is saying that the deepest part of being his disciple is not being religious, but being a good human being who knows how to stretch the helping hand, how to do things for other people without expecting much in return, how to look for the best in people. As a teacher, I found that that really helped in dealing with those very difficult students. Because in all the years of being homeroom for grade 12, it seemed like almost every year I would get the most difficult student in the grade 12. But working with this at the back of my mind, and people can sense it, that you don't have any negative thoughts about them or any evil thoughts about them, that you haven't prejudged them, that it enabled that student to come out of his or her nastiness and become a little different person, at least in the homeroom, if not necessarily everywhere. And so that is the heartbeat of true religion. Not how much tithe or whether we've been to church every Sabbath and how many Bible verses we've memorized, but our ability to be there for people, never to judge them on the one hand, but to have not to have unrealistic expectations at the same time, but to always look for the good in other people. And then the rest of chapter 7 deals with what I call the two principle. And Jesus uses several things to deal with this. He talks about the two gates. He says the narrow gate is like a gate, or think of it, these days we don't have gates to roads, but we do have gantries, so it's the same thing. Think of it going through a tollway. Okay, it's just a single entryway, tollway, that opens up into maybe a mountain road or a limited highway. He says there's the other gate, the big gate that opens into a broad road, a motorway, multi-lane motorways. Most of the tollways in Thailand have to do with the expressways and the motorways. He says that narrow gate and that narrow road is the one that will get you to heaven, to the kingdom of God. The broad gate and the broad road is the easy one. That's where the crowd is. That's the one that will get you in the wrong place. Jesus is suggesting that his kingdom is not easy. Entry into his kingdom is not simple, but destination is guaranteed. The way of the world is much easier. It's just easier to be a part of the crowd, to go along with everybody else, to drive on that motorway. One of the things about driving on the motorway is you don't really have to pay too much attention. You don't even have to do too much activity. Just stick to your lane and stick to the speed limit and you go on. But when you are on a mountain road, even though it may be called a highway, you have to be absolutely alert. All of your senses have to be alive. You can't lose concentration for even a second. I have watched people from Bangkok when I went up to the mountains, like Chiang Mai, Doi Inthanon, and Phetchabun, Khao Kho, those kinds of areas. I watched these people from Bangkok who have lived in this flat, plain, full of motorways city. They don't know how to drive up on the mountains. I remember going up to the summer palace, or one of the summer palaces of the royal family in Phetchabun. The last 3 kilometers, the road, the incline is quite a steep incline. And if you don't know how to drive uphill, and even worse, coming downhill from that incline, you will burn a lot of rubber because people are braking too hard. They're pushing the gear too much. They're riding on the wrong gear. I can still remember when I reached the top of the mountain at the palace parking lot and I stepped out of the car, all I could smell was the smell of burnt rubber. Not so much from my car, but from all these Bangkokians who didn't know how to drive a mountain road. They somehow made it up there, but they burned a lot of their brake pads and their tire rubber in the process of getting up there. It got worse when they were coming down because most people think the way to slow a car down when you're coming down a hill is applying the brake, but that is a way of killing your brake pads very fast. A better way of slowing a car down is what is called gear braking. But most people don't know how to do that, especially when they're driving with automatic gears. And so the kingdom of God is like that. You have to learn things. You have to discover things that you must, that are more demanding on you, that require your senses and your concentration. The second two principle are the two trees. And this is kind of interesting. He says, because I'm seeing it with my mango tree outside, he says, a good tree, a tree that is in good health, will produce good fruit. A tree that is not in good health will not produce good fruit. He said it's a very simple thing that any farmer knows. And this is why we apply fertilizer, we water, we help that tree to grow. And this applies to every plant, from paddy to mango trees or durian trees. You have to know if the tree needs a lot of water or if the tree needs less water. Date trees need minimal water. Durian trees need an awful lot of water. Rice paddies need a lot of water. Wheat and millets don't need much water. But what they need is preparation of the soil. And you can see on the tree, when the tree is not healthy, the leaves are falling off, the branches are brittle, you see something happen to the trunk. And when the tree is healthy, the leaves are nice and green. Um, Branches are not simply breaking off on their own. Okay, and the trunk looks healthy, it's not peeling off. And the fruit is always dependent on that quality. So Jesus says, what we do depends on what kind of person we are. A person who is unkind in his thoughts can never really do kind things. Once in a while, but not as a way of life. By the same token, a person who's kind in his thoughts will be kind even when faced with people who are the opposite of kind to them. Then the third principle is this: two foundations. Where do you build your house? If you build it on a rock, it will withstand a flash flood. You have to understand how flash floods work in very dry countries like the Middle East. I met a couple who had just left Dubai, and Dubai had the worst floods ever in their history, and they didn't know what to do because there's not much solid foundation. Everything is sand. Now, the analogy Jesus used is from these riverbeds, they're called wadis in the Middle East, that are dry most of the year, and then heavy rain comes for 1 month or for a week or whatever, and it turns into a raging river. And yet, they can be very easy places to build your house or to build something on, by the side or even on that wadi. But the ground is shallow and it's easily disturbed by a flash flood. And so he says, if you build your house on sand, that's the sand he's talking about. Of course, it'll be carried away by that flash flood. Now, in seaside communities where the waves are always coming in and going out, they build their houses, if they live off the land, with stilts deep into the shore, so that even if the water goes out, the tide goes out, or it comes heavy tide, or even storm tide, their houses will still survive. It's all about that foundation. Our Christian life is dependent on the foundation. A young pastor told me about a church that he went to for the first time and was told by the members, we don't want to study Bible here. Just give us simple little sermons so we can be happy and go home. Don't do any serious Bible study. That church has no foundation. And I guarantee you, if there's a big storm that hits that church, it will not survive. And you can see in all these three sets, the two gates, the two trees, the two foundations, they all deal with a similar principle, that quality and quantity are not the same thing. Having a big, wide open road or a big tree or a easily built house does not determine the quality and the longevity of that house or that road. To build a good house requires effort. To grow a good fruit tree requires effort. To drive on a mountain road going upwards to the top of the mountain requires effort as well. So in this final segment of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, make sure you know the entry point, make sure you know the quality of life, and make sure that you build on the right foundation. Otherwise, everything you know will probably collapse. But this comes with a warning. The very last thing at the Sermon on the Mount, something that many people seem to ignore. Jesus says this, not everyone who calls to me, Lord, Lord, he's talking about when he returns, will enter the kingdom of heaven. The reaction of the people was, wow, what kind of teaching is this? What kind of teacher is this? He said things that were difficult to swallow, and yet their response was, he taught with real authority. Now, those religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, who were the main religious teachers at the time of Jesus, they were learned, They knew their Bibles inside out. Most rabbis have memorized the Torah, not just then, even now. And yet, when they listened to Jesus, it was different. There was an authority to what he says, that ability to say, I say to you. And the way he carried simple ideas to a higher level, higher concept, that somehow it made him feel different. If a church doesn't want to really learn, if you have a preacher who preaches the Bible solidly, they are going to complain and want him changed. You see, because we only have human authority, but clearly they could sense something else about Jesus, that he could say and do something that the rabbis, the great rabbis of their days, really could not. And so the Sermon on the Mount ends with an affirmation of Jesus' preaching and teaching credentials, if you like. It's like giving him an award, best teacher in the world, or some award like that. And that essentially how the Sermon on the Mount ends. This is different. You don't see this with other sermons or with anywhere else in the gospel. But at the end of this sermon, after sitting there and listening to all these things, most of which they probably could not absorb yet, they had to say, wow, no one has ever taught us like this. Now, one of the joys about being preacher of the word is that sometimes people will say that to you. Wow, how come I never saw that before? I never thought it applied to me before. And then you knew that you have really spoken the word. When people say a nice sermon, usually it doesn't mean very much. Okay. One of the most meaningful reactions, this happened in Singapore. There was an American couple, they worked with the division at the time. They were regular members of the church, very supportive, very musical family. And I preached a sermon. I don't even remember what it was about, but it was something about overcoming adversity, something to that effect. At the end of the sermon, the wife, who seemed like a very strong Christian, always positive and so on, she said, Pastor Fanwar, that sermon was just for me. Were you thinking about me when you preach? I said, wait a minute, I'm a little bit lost. What do you mean? Was I thinking about you? She said, what you address in the sermon is the very thing that I have been wrestling with this week, and I just needed that encouragement that you brought through your sermon. I said, you would be the last person in this church I would have guessed was struggling with that particular issue. I said, no, I wasn't thinking about you. I know there are other people who are wrestling with this a particular headache of life, but I didn't think you were one of them. But she said that to me, and I'm like, wow, if nobody else listened to that sermon, that person did. And it meant something to her. It moved her, it made her feel and respond to something uh, that was a real headache in her life for that particular week. I met the opposite of a lady who walked up to me one day at the door and said, Pastor Fanwar, I really don't like your sermon. I said, how come? It's actually not that she doesn't like my sermon or my preaching style. She actually likes them. But that particular sermon had triggered something that she didn't want to deal with. Because we sat, after she said that to me, I hate your sermon. I really don't like your preaching. We sat and talked about it. And it turns out that she didn't like my preaching or hated my sermon, but that the sermon forced her to deal with a problem in her life that she was trying to camouflage. She was trying to cover up. She didn't want to deal. She knew it was a spiritual struggle that she should come to terms with, but she didn't want to do it. But the sermon forced her to do it. She said, oh, I hate you for making me do that. But we had a really good long counseling session and brought out all the things that she needed to experience. Now, I can relate a little bit, small scale, what those people must have felt when they listened to Jesus. This is how I felt when I heard Morris Venden preach. Not a very exciting preacher, but for the first time in my life, I learned about grace. I was about 16, 17 years old. For the first time, I learned about grace, and it just changed my view of God, my view of my faith, my view of religion, and set the path for my life's career, my life's work, my life's studies, and so on. And so I think this is why the Sermon on the Mount has had such an appeal to Christians for 2,000 years. But I wish that we would all listen to the last sermon of Jesus here, the last warning, of Jesus. Just because we know the sermon inside out does not mean he is really Lord in our lives. What is our worldview? What perspective, priority do we have in dealing with ourselves, with the world around us, with people around us, and with these demands of the kingdom? When we do that, then we will be like the audience. We will see Christ in all of his authority. There is a little saying that I always recite to myself from time to time in case I forget. It says this, that Jesus cannot be Lord at all unless he is Lord of all. There is no such thing as giving part of our lives to God. No, it has to be the whole thing. He has to be the complete Lord. It's not enough to give a guest room of our lives to him, but to give the entire house to him, so to speak. Cannot be Lord at all if he is not Lord of all. And so we've been through the Sermon on the Mount. Next week, we will look at his second major sermon, which is the Mount of Olives sermon. That's the sermon that deals with Jesus' thoughts on the end times. For those of you who may not know, I will be doing a webinar on that subject on the 25th of this month. It's a morning time here, but to accommodate people everywhere else, hopefully we can do that. And so that sermon of Jesus next week will help focus some of our thinking of Christ about the end of the world. We are all very concerned about the end of the world. And as we look at the world around us, we wonder if the things that Jesus talks about, when we see the hatred of people, the unwillingness to compromise, the willingness to troll somebody online, mother and son fighting online over money in a way that the whole world can read, that's the world we live in. That's not the kingdom of God. And something for us to think about as we wind up this evening.